Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back for yet another session of your favorite game show, Kentucky Court Interpreter Orientation. All right, let's do this. Thank you for being here with us. This is the next presentation in the series of mini presentations that we are putting together for the orientation for new court interpreters. I'm Joshua Elliott, the Executive Officer of the Office of Language Access. With me today is my wonderful co-presenter, Armada Liste Gonzalez, who is our Operations Manager. Armada, want to say hello?
Hello, once again, everybody. We're ready to roll in just a few minutes.
Let's do this. Marta and I, of course, as you can see from our backgrounds, we're located in exactly the same place. We have two cameras, but she's right beside me, right over here. Hey, Marta, right? It's incredible how the virtual technology does this. So speaking of virtual technology, keep in mind, as we always say at the beginning of these, there could be some minor things along the way. You know that. We could have some glitches. Sometimes technology doesn't do what it's supposed to do. That's okay. Bear with us, give us plenty of grace, and I promise you we'll get through this and give you some excellent information to get you started on your career as a court interpreter. So today we're going to talk about really two topics of great importance. First, we're going to talk about bilingualism in the courtroom. I'm going to cover a few slides. In a previous presentation, we had sort of touched on bilingualism. I want to go into much more detail now. After we finish talking about bilingualism, Marta is going to take us through skills, traits, qualities that are important for professional court interpreters. She's sort of going to highlight some of the things that professional court interpreters typically have in common, things they do well, traits that they tend to exhibit. Of course, any list we give you is not going to be exhaustive, and one size does not fit all, but I think we can give you an idea of some of the important characteristics of good court interpreters. So we'll get there in a few minutes. First, let's talk a little bit of bilingualism in the courtroom. As our wonderful model here says, hablo español, I speak Spanish, sort of. Is that going to cut it? Well, I think we got to talk about it just a little bit. So let's talk about bilingualism. Let's start first by defining bilingualism. And there's really no secret here. Bilingualism is defined as the ability to speak two languages or dialects. Let's define a little bit what a language is versus what a dialect is, because what happens is that sometimes people tend to use the word dialect in a pejorative way, right? In a way that makes it seem less than a language. And really, linguistically, nothing could be farther from the truth. So when we talk about a language, you can think of like a general umbrella. We talk about English. The general umbrella language is English. We call it English, right? But under this umbrella of English, you have different variations. We might call them variations, right? And so if we're again talking about English, we have American English, and we have British English, and we have Australian English, we have Canadian English. And actually within those variations, you have lots of sub-variations. So in the United States, we have Southern English, and we have Northern English, right? Eastern and Western, all these sub-variations. That's what we mean when we talk about dialects, okay? So you may speak two languages, those big umbrella overarching languages that we're talking about, or you may speak two variants or dialects of the same language. We also need interpreters sometimes for those, because sometimes those dialects or variants are mutually intelligible and sometimes they're actually not. They're so different that really an interpreter is required. That's what we mean here. So I want to make sure up front that we understand dialect is not somehow some type of inferior language that we deal with in the courts. Not at all, really. They're all languages, and then there are variants of those languages. We might call them dialects as well. So also, I think up front, it's important to mention that being bilingual is an individual characteristic. There's no group of people that would be bilingual just because. So it's not collective in nature. We can't say, in a country where there were two official languages, for example, we can't say that everyone in that country would be completely bilingual or bilingual on the same level, right, as everyone else. Just doesn't work that way. I studied, actually worked for a little while in Paraguay, right? And so I went there, a very interesting place. Linguistically, it's fascinating because what's happened there, they have two national languages. They have, of course, Spanish, which is why I was there. And then they have an indigenous language called Guarani. and both are national languages. And Paraguayans are very proud, for the most part, of their bilingual heritage, of the fact that they do have two languages. But it's very interesting when you work in Paraguay, right? Depending on where you are, you will find people who are more or less bilingual. So at first, we were in the capital city of Asuncion. And as I interacted with the population there, it was very Spanish dominant, right? My Spanish skills were very popular there because I was there with a group of non-Spanish speakers and I was the interpreter, right? So I'm interpreting for this group, Spanish, again, very dominant. There were people who spoke Guarani very well, but we always interacted in Spanish. Everybody really spoke Spanish. As we moved away from the city into the country, that dynamic started to change. And as we traveled farther and farther, it actually changed so much that there was no Spanish to be found. We interacted with people who were purely Guarani speakers. And in fact, my interpreting skills didn't really help us too much until we found somebody to assist me in understanding what they were saying in Guarani into Spanish and then from Spanish into English. So no group of people is completely bilingual just because there is variation even among bilingual groups, right? There are many different degrees of bilingualism. We're going to talk about a couple of those degrees in a moment. It's important, I think, to mention that someone's degree of bilingualism may change based on the situation. So you may be very bilingual in some settings, but not nearly as bilingual in other settings, right? Um, I think about my own background, all of my higher education was done in Spanish. I feel very comfortable in academic contexts. I can talk all day long about linguistics and literature and, have those really high level cerebral conversations. Fantastic. Very bilingual in that setting. Same thing with court. I feel very comfortable in both English and Spanish, talking about any court concept you want to really mention. No problem. Now, let's go to a bar surrounded by a bunch of my best Cuban buddies, and we're talking about baseball. Much more difficult conversation for me to have. Now, it's not that I can't do it, but my bilingualism changes a little bit in that setting, right? And I see Armada smiling because she's Cuban. She knows what I'm talking about, man. That's a hard conversation. I love those conversations, but it's hard. So, it's going to change a little bit depending on the setting. So, the key question maybe for us up front is, are you bilingual enough to go to court, right? And that's a high standard. So we're going to talk a little more about that. Let's talk first, however, about some of these degrees of bilingualism that I mentioned. And there are two here that I think we have to recognize. So first off, there's something called total or complete bilingualism. This entails total proficiency in both languages in any situation. And so here, it's not that you know every word in both languages. It's not that. That's not what I mean by complete or total. But what I do mean is that anything that you can say in one language, your native language, you can say it just as well and just as fluently in the other language. And so for practical purposes, you have two native languages, right? I mean, you're just as good, whether it's English or your foreign language, it's all the same. Everything that you say in one language, you can say just as well, just as fluently, just as naturally in the other language. And the thing is, this is actually very rare, usually simply because most people don't have exactly the same experiences in both of their languages. You may be very bilingual, right? Most court interpreters are very bilingual, but it's rare to find someone who has had the same life experiences, same education, same upbringing in both languages, right? Just to give you a simple example, um, I feel like with preparation, I could probably interpret most any type of event. Could I walk in and do it as fluently as I interpret in court? If it's something completely outside of that realm, it would require some effort on my part. I think, for example, about a funeral, just something basic. A funeral. I've gone to lots of funerals in English, unfortunately. I have never attended a funeral conducted in Spanish. Now, in theory, I know how that should work. I would know the right things, I guess, to say. Would it sound as natural? Would it be as fluent as, I could do that in English? Probably not. It's not an experience that I've had. I would have to work. I'd have to make up the difference. So that's what we talk about with complete or total bilingualism. Anything you can say in one language, you can say it just as well in the other language. There have probably only been a few people in my lifetime that I've met that I thought maybe were completely bilingual. You know, two or three of them, I just were really impressed with their language skills on every level. I bet that if I dug far enough, right? I dug deep enough. I bet I could find something that they don't do quite as well in one language as they do the other. Typically, there's a difference in experiences there somewhere along the way. Very rare to find this. Is it fair for us to require that court interpreters be completely, totally bilingual? Oh no, think about that for a moment. Let's go to the other side of the spectrum here. We have something called rudimentary bilingualism. It's the extreme opposite of what we just described, and unfortunately, it's much more common. So what happens here is that many people are dominant, completely fluent in one language, but they have very limited abilities in a second language. And so maybe they can do specific tasks in that second language. You know, I have a Mexican restaurant right around my house here that I love to go to. It's a fantastic place. It's got great salsa. I love Mexican food, so it's got great Mexican salsa. I go there. I'm not talking about dancing either. I'm talking about the stuff you eat with the chips, okay? You don't want to see me dance salsa. So I go there, and I've got friends that are waiters there, and many of them are actual, honest to goodness Mexicans, right? You know, they're actually of Mexican heritage. They're here. They're Spanish dominant, and in watching them perform their job, their role at the restaurant, it's very interesting because you see rudimentary bilingualism. They can do certain things in English. You know, some of them can, of course, ask you what you want to eat that day. They can go through the menu a little bit. They can tell a joke. They can maybe talk about the weather. They've learned things to do a very specific job. But at some point, the English runs out, right? At some point, they have to revert back to Spanish to be functional. If not, they just can't function, right? Outside of that very limited environment. And, you know, lo and behold, after they take your order, they'll go back to the kitchen and it's all in Spanish, right? They're describing everything in Spanish. That's just how they work. And so we're talking about a very functional level of bilingualism, very limited for very specific purposes. Is that going to work for court interpreting? Obviously not, right? We'll come back to that in just a moment. So we have these two extremes and we have everything in between. What we're going to try to do in the next few slides, we're going to figure out where in the world you need to be on this spectrum to be a court interpreter. Is it completely bilingual? Is it rudimentary bilingual? Or is there something in between? We're going to have to define that. So let's go forward a little bit. What really happens normally, most people fall somewhere between those two extremes on the spectrum that I'm mentioning. And typically we will have a dominant language and we will have a subordinate language. And so your dominant language is the one that you would prefer for most things. And there's a subordinate weaker language, perhaps. We don't like to say weaker, but I mean, let's face it, it's a little weaker, okay? And maybe you can use that in more specific settings, but maybe not in a full range of communication, just in every event possible, right? And as we mentioned before, it's normal for most bilinguals to handle each of the two languages well in certain contexts, but maybe not every context. So like I said, you know, there's literature talking about academics, literature, linguistics, versus talking about baseball, talking about sports. Can you do both things extremely well? You know, there's academic versus non-academic. Where are you most comfortable, right? Also, we have to consider the fact that one's level of bilingualism may be stable or unstable based on the frequency of use. You may be English dominant, but you have lived in a Spanish speaking country for the past 30 years. And at some point, English ceases to be your dominant language. You actually become Spanish dominant, right? You forget your native language. It happens all the time, especially here in the US. You come here to the US, you're here for a long, long time, and at some point, English becomes your dominant language. Except for the fact that, you know, if people talk to you, they realize that your native language perhaps isn't English. There's always a leftover accent, right? It's not that it's not your dominant language now, but it's not quite native either. It's a very strange thing. It's a strange phenomenon that happens, right? Um, Again, that may be stable or unstable based on how much you use it. Maybe you've heard the phrase, use it or lose it. In terms of languages, you use it or lose it. That's definitely been my experience. There are times I get very rusty if I haven't talked about a topic, and this is true in both English and Spanish for me, but if I haven't talked about a topic in one language or another for a while, sometimes those words tend to not be as quickly retrieved as they once were. Got to keep up with it all the time. Got to keep practicing, keep plying your trade, keep improving your skills. So what we're really describing here on some level is something called diglossia. And Deglossia is a linguistics term, and I'm a linguistics guy, so I have a master's degree with an emphasis in linguistics. So that's why I throw some of this stuff in there sometimes. Um, but Deglossia is a situation in which, in a given society, there are two often closely related languages, one of which is considered to have high prestige, and that's the one that's generally used by government and formal texts. And then there's one that we might say is of lower prestige, which is usually the spoken vernacular tongue. What that means is it's used at home, it's used in less formal settings, social settings. That high prestige language, or we might call it the A language, that tends to be the more formalized language. It also tends to be formalized in its forms, the different verb forms, the vocabulary that's used, and a lot of times that will filter into that B language, or that that second low prestige language. So you have a lot of influence from the A language in the B language. So we think about this in the United States. Are there any examples that we might highlight? Yeah, I mean, there are a few. You think about along the southwestern border of the US, for example. Lot of influence from Mexico, of course, from other Spanish-speaking countries as well. A lot of Spanish speakers there on both sides of the border. In the US specifically, what happens is that English would be that high prestige language. You would use that at school. You would probably use that in most cases at your work, at least on an official capacity. It would be the language of government in those border towns. However, on a vernacular level, speaking in social settings or going home, more than likely there's some Spanish being used, maybe a lot of Spanish being used, but perhaps with English influence. That English has filtered into that language over time. And so we have maybe an individual who speaks both languages, speaks them well, but in different settings. And maybe one language is heavily influenced by the other, maybe both ways, to be honest. And then we say, okay, can that person be a court interpreter? Can that person now take the language skills, keep the languages pure, separate the two languages, and use them in this very formal setting of court? And it is a formal setting, but sometimes we deal with informal things as well. So can you use it in a variety of ways in this court setting? I don't know. You tell me, can you do that? That's really what we're talking about here. We'll get back to that in just a moment. Deglossia has social implications. Depending on how well you use one language or the other, socially you may be considered of high prestige or low prestige as well. Unfortunately, sometimes sociolinguistically, the way that one speaks determines how others view that person as well. And that's true in our line with interpreters as well. These types of social implications still apply. Is it enough to simply be bilingual then? So first, let's answer this. What form of bilingualism is necessary in order to be successful as a court interpreter? Okay, so we talked about our spectrum. Remember this? And we have over here completely bilingual, and we have over here somebody with rudimentary bilingualism. Where should we be? Okay, so obviously rudimentary bilingualism not going to work. That's not going to do it. We know that. Now, completely bilingualism, we talked about how this is maybe even not even possible, very rare to find this. So maybe this isn't a good standard either, but where do we have to be on this spectrum, right? Well, let's start with the middle. Is it enough to just be in the middle, the middle of this spectrum? Hmm. Average, basic, maybe you have good communication skills for the most part, but I think court interpreting requires a little bit more than that because it's a very specialized field. In court interpreting as well, you have to know a little bit about everything because all kinds of crazy stuff comes up in court. So I think we're beyond the middle point then. Maybe we're 3/4 of the way, so you're close to complete bilingualism. Maybe not quite there. Maybe you're 75, 80%, 85%. We're constantly pushing. I've been doing court interpreting for a long time. Spanish is one of the few passions that I have in life. I read a lot. I interact with the Spanish community, Spanish-speaking community. I go out of my way to improve my skills. Can I say that I'm completely bilingual? No, no, I cannot. I'll never get there, unfortunately. Now, am I closer to that than I was when I started? Absolutely. I'm constantly inching my way forward. Again, 75 maybe is a good starting point. Maybe we should be at 80, 85, 90. We should keep pushing. The day I retire, maybe I hit 98. I don't know. I doubt it, right? I don't think I'm ever going to get that far, but I'm going to be pushing toward that the whole time. Keep that in mind. I think when you determine and consider your bilingual skills and where you currently are, I think for getting into court interpreting, or at least for being able to pass the exam and start court interpreting, I think you have to be, that 3/4 mark, 75, 80%. I think you have to be around there to have any chance of really being successful as a court interpreter. That would be generally my thought. There are some tests that we give throughout this process, we'll talk about in another presentation, where we help you determine your language skills and where you currently are. I think you have to be very proficient in both languages, 75, 80 plus percent, to really be able to get started in this field. Is the same level of proficiency required needed in order to be an effective family interpreter? Now, this is interesting. So we have to be moving towards completely bilingual. We go back to the example that I used in another presentation. You go into Walmart and you're there with your parents. Your parents don't speak any English, and your mom wants to buy a dress, and she just tells you, "Son, go over there and ask that guy how much the dress is." And you go over and you say, "Hey, my mom wants to know how much is the dress. How much does the dress cost?" "It's $7." "Mom, it's $7. Do you want the dress?" "Yeah, I want the dress." Okay, so you bought the dress. Does that require the same level of fluency as you might need in court interpreting? Well, no. I mean, you're at Walmart, right? You're buying a dress. Of course not. Doesn't mean that because you're not necessarily bilingual enough to be a court interpreter that you can't interpret well in some settings. But there's specialized skill and a very high degree of accuracy needed in court interpreting that might not be present in these other situations. So could you interpret in other settings potentially and do it quite well and get the point across? Yes. In court interpreting, however, such a regulated environment, where it can be very high stakes, there can be some pressure, the specialized vocabulary, a higher level of bilingualism will certainly be needed as well. Let's talk about medical interpreters. Many of you may be medical interpreters and you may practice actively even in the medical field. What level of bilingualism is needed and why? And I can honestly tell you, this is sort of a pet peeve of mine, because what sometimes people tell me is, oh, medical interpreting is easier, and you don't have to be as bilingual to be a medical interpreter as you do to be a court interpreter. People have told me that. I should probably disclose as well, I am a medical interpreter. I have a certification, one of the two existing certifications. I've taken and passed that exam. It's the CCHI exam if you're interested. So I'm a certified healthcare interpreter. My experience has been anything but that. A very high level of bilingualism is needed in medical settings. The stakes are equally as high, right? Now it's different. Um, in court, what can happen if you're not accurate? Well, somebody could die, or they could go to jail forever. In the hospital, what could happen if you're not accurate? Well, somebody could die. They could lose their life, right? Very high stakes. What is different is the environment itself. Sometimes because of the role that you're playing in that setting, you do have more flexibility. You're part of the treatment team. It's the opposite of an adversarial setting. Everybody's working together for the well-being of the patient, right? So it's a little bit of a different thing, and I get that. But if you are currently a medical interpreter, a good one, okay, high level, high skills, really, really competent skills, um, do you have a high level of bilingualism, and would that translate well to court interpreting? Probably, I would say so. Both require a very high level of competency. So can medical interpreters, competent medical interpreters, become legal interpreters? Absolutely. The role's a little different, but maybe we have a really good foundation there, absolutely, that we can build off of. So keep that in mind. That's very valid work. Interpreting in Walmart for your parents maybe doesn't prepare you very well. Interpreting in a medical setting, doing it very well, working to improve your trade and your skills, absolutely, very valuable skills. And there's a lot of intersection between the medical field and the legal field. Sometimes it becomes very medical in legal settings. So based on what we've learned about bilingualism, you guys answer the question then, wherever you are, answer out loud. Is it enough to simply be bilingual? Is that really enough? I think we know the answer now, no. Um, Certainly those are the building blocks. Your language skills will be the building block for getting where you want to go, but it's not enough just to be bilingual. On that scale of bilingualism, we have to be pushing toward, always toward, the completely or totally bilingual state. May never get there, and that's okay, but you got to be pretty close to it when you start, and you got to improve constantly as you go forward. Ultimately, if you're not there, can you get there? Maybe. The good news is language skills um, are some of the easiest things to improve if you're willing to work hard. There are other skills needed in interpreting that Marta will go over with us in just a moment in some slides. Some of them are harder to improve than language skills. I think of interpreting skills, right? Or I think of just a general lack of talent for interpreting. Hard to overcome that. But if what you need to improve is your language skills, your level of bilingualism, well, that has not an easy fix, but it does have a pretty solid solution. And basically, it's hard work. It's hard work and study, and you can get where you want to go. All right. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Imarta. She's going to talk a little bit now about skills, traits, and qualities needed in order to be successful as a court interpreter. As we talked about before, one size doesn't fit all, but I think she can give you a clear idea of some of the things that successful court interpreters typically have in common. Imarta?
That's right. Thank you, Joshua. So there's a triangle when we're talking about interpretation, and Joshua gave us sort of an introduction into it. There are the language skills, the natural talent, and the interpreting skills. You can work on the language skills, or you already have them, like Joshua says. You may have been educated, in the United States, like Joshua, grew up speaking English, and then he went and did his Spanish thing in college. So he has those language skills already. Then you have the natural talent. It comes natural to you. It does happen to some people. Some people are better at languages than others. And then the interpreting skills that you have to work on and develop with practice, because as I always say, there's an expression in the law that says the law is a jealous mistress. Well, I find that language is an even more jealous mistress than the law. Language, as you probably know, develops and grows with society. So the more technologically advanced a society is, the more words they have relating to technology. The more primitive a society is, they lack that. So, you have to put all those things into the picture to understand how this whole thing works. So what do you need? Skills, traits, qualities, highly proficient in both English and the language of the limited English proficiency individual. Because as we were saying before, there is a lot going on in courts, in the court system. We all started with very simple cases, district court, misdemeanor, traffic cases, things of that sort. But eventually you keep moving up. You move up to criminal cases, murder cases, drug trafficking. So that is going to require that you have high register to be able to convey all that information that you're going to get into the same level register of the other language, of the target language. If you go to a trial, murder trial, you will probably have a ballistics expert talking about weapons and bullets and things of that sort. You may have a DNA expert explaining all those things to the jury, and you will have to put that into that high register language for the defendant. Or it could be a witness that saw what happened, and it is a very simple, humble person that just happened to be there, and they are going to speak in that humble and simple language, and you will have to put it back into that same register in English. Something else that goes with it, the ability to maintain impartiality even in emotionally taxing situations. For me, the worst cases where I have interpreted, Joshua, are those that involved molestation, sexual abuse of children. And I also did a very difficult case. I wasn't prepared. They just called me to the courtroom. That was back in Florida. And when I get there, it's a mother whose daughter was murdered, and she's giving what is called a victim impact statement. The lady started crying. I had to compose myself. It was very difficult to do, and especially because I didn't know what I was getting into. That will happen a lot. And you have to stay detached, impartial. There will be situations in which you don't like the attorney or the judge or even the person for whom you are interpreting, but you have to divest yourself of all those feelings and just keep it cool, for lack of an even better expression. Just divest yourself, stay impartial. You're just there to do a job, and also be honest with yourself and with everybody else. If it comes to a point that you can't do it, it is better to admit it. We'll talk about a a little bit more about that when we cover ethics. Uh,
Uh,
some,
Imarda, to jump in, that's a fantastic point, and I agree with Imarda. The hardest things for me now are usually things related to child abuse. I have four little kids, and it's really hard for me to see that. One of the worst things I ever interpreted, again, just to highlight some of this,
Mhm.
I was a federal staff interpreter for close to 2 years in Miami, Florida. And on a federal level, one of the crimes that you deal with is child pornography. Um, and I got assigned to a case. It was one of the most horrible things that you can really think of. Um, the father had created numerous tapes of child pornography with his daughter, and they'd found all these tapes, and it was just horrible. And I had to read through the documentation to prepare for the case. And there was a victim impact statement, like Armada said, from the daughter, who is now older. The things that were done were unspeakable, unthinkable things. To go into court and interpret that, for them to explain graphically what had happened, um, horrible. Not all traffic tickets where we interpret. I think this is something that we underestimate, but super important.
Mhm. Absolutely. And through all that, you have to keep your composure. Sometimes you have to swallow your own tears. You know, I have seen interpreters with a lot more seasoned than I was at the time, and they had trouble keeping it together, and they excused themselves. And I have done it too. I've had a partner who keeps interpreting. You know, we switched, and I took that moment to go out of the courtroom, drink a little bit of water, get back in, and do your job. So you got to learn to control those things. Um, Number three, ability or able to precisely transfer meaning from the source language into the target language without altering the intended meaning. And Joshua talked a little bit about this throughout his whole presentation, and what we have been doing is what the native English speaker would have heard. The person who doesn't speak English needs to hear the same message. You don't alter the intended meaning, and I think the whole thing about expressions, made expressions, sayings, all that goes into that. It's not just also a literal interpretation of word for word. Is the meaning is what matters. The context gives you the meaning many times. And being good at the three modes of interpretation that we discussed earlier: simultaneous, consecutive, uh, side translation. Your communication skills and your ability to speak in public must also be good, because at some point, if you are next to the witness on the witness stand, you will be the center of attention. Ideally, as an interpreter, you are as inconspicuous as possible. When you are interpreting for the defendant, you should be quiet. You shouldn't create any noise that disturbs the proceedings, that your voice goes over other people. But when you are at the witness stand and a witness is testifying, you are the center of attention, whether it is the lawyers and the judge, if it is just a hearing, or the jury, if it is a jury trial. You will be the one giving them what they hear and what they will use in good part to make their decisions. So you have to be comfortable speaking in public. You have to have that skill and, properly presented. Nobody wants to see an interpreter that is all discombobulated and, doesn't stand straight if you're standing up. So it's a package that requires a lot of things. And ability to demonstrate high professional standards for courtroom demeanor and professional conduct. Yes, there is a code of conduct that we have, like all professions. We are not just a little machine that puts things from one language into another. There is more into it. It's a profession. So there is a certain decorum, court behavior, the way you treat other people, the way you address the participants. Even if this guy is a murderer or a rapist, at the time that you're there, it's not for you to judge. This is a person that requires your services to communicate with the court, and everybody's to be treated with respect. Listen and talk at the same time. That is going to happen when you're doing simultaneous interpretation. Normally, this will happen during arguments, with the attorneys, and you can see why. If an attorney has a train of thought, and or if they are reading jury instructions, it's very hard to be interrupting that person. Normally, if it is a long hearing like that or a trial, you have equipment, equipment that you as an interpreter will have a transmitter, and the person who needs your services has a receiver with headphones, and there will be conversation going on, argument from the attorneys, ruling from the judge in English, and you will be simultaneously putting that into your target language. Note-taking skills are necessary for consecutive, which is the one mode of interpretation Joshua explained earlier. Question, you interpret, the person gives an answer, you put it back into English. So interpret, stop, question, answer. But there is that moment where you may need notes depending on how much the person is speaking. I find that notes can get in the way sometimes. It depends on how long the person is speaking, on how much they have to say, and how organized their thought process is. You will find all kinds of people in the courtroom, and sometimes it is easier to interpret for an attorney to interpret a question than it is to interpret the answer from the witness, because of their education level or because of how emotionally involved they are in the subject. So the notes will help, but you also have to pay a lot of attention. Highly developed memory skills. This one comes with time. Memory is a time and practice, more practice than time, because a lot of times, like I said, notes get in the way and your memory is better, and the notes should be just an assistance to your memory. If you think about it, the example I like to give is that sometimes you come home and you run into a friend and they tell you about a movie they were watching at the theater, and the story goes on for 5-10 minutes, and you go home and you say, that was a really good movie, and you tell your partner about it. We need to go see this movie, there's so and so, and it was about this and this and that, and you put all that back together, those 5-7 minutes of narration about a movie that you didn't see. Why? Because it piqued your interest and you were paying attention, which is where attentive listening skills come into. It's all a package. You little by little, you put it all together, but it takes a lot of work. You have to pay attention when people are talking, and we are human, we're not machines. Some subjects are more interesting than others, and it is very easy to find yourself checking out if you are not interested, but you have to check back in and pay attention, because the easiest way to remember something is to pay attention and be engaged in what is being said. As far as consecutive interpretation goes, obviously with simultaneous, you need to pay attention to, but it is happening at the same time, sort of. So when you start interpreting, Joshua, I don't know how it was for you, but a lot of interpreters I've spoken to, in my experience, I was terrified of simultaneous. And eventually you realize that if you know the subject, it is easier than consecutive, because consecutive, like people could be talking forever, like I have been doing now for the last 5 minutes. Can you imagine if somebody had to interpret all that I'm saying right now for somebody else consecutively? Either their memory will have to be excellent or their notes outstanding. So eventually you will find out that with practice and dedication, your simultaneous may be better than your consecutive. Okay, high level of self-awareness at all times, especially as it relates to demeanor, expressions, and behaviors. This is very important. Goes back to detaching yourself from what is going on from your personal point of view. No facial expressions that demonstrate how much you like or dislike somebody. You need to be aware of what you're doing. You need to be aware of what your face is conveying, what your body posture is conveying. And we have a code of ethics and professionalism that we will address in the next few days dealing with all of these. Curiosity for languages. Again, language is a living thing. As society progresses, I find that I go back to Cuba, and when I talk to my cousins or my generation, I talk to their children. Obviously, we can understand each other, but they always come up with a word or two that, by virtue of not being there, I no longer know in which context they're using it or what it means, or it's simply different from what we were using when I was growing up and I was their age. So you have to be curious about it. It is a jealous mistress. It's not the same everywhere. And, helping, like Joshua said, reading a lot helps, watching movies in other languages, all that. We have so many resources now that would make it easier to get better at a language, much more than when we started and when people that preceded us started, when they had to do everything based on books. You have to commit. You have to commit. It's a never-ending process. You always have to be improving. You have to read. You have to study language courses, continuing education, which is a requirement of the profession. Again, because it is a profession, because we're supposed to be professionals of what we do, and because what we do is so important, and so many things in people's lives depend on it, even if it is a civil case. In Kentucky, we interpret in civil cases, we interpret in family cases. Very important things are at stake. Parental rights, the ability of children to be protected and well cared for within their family unit. So you have to be committed to be good at it, and understand that the moment you decide, or you gave yourself this idea that you know everything there was to know in language, you probably need to stop doing it, because there is no such thing. There will always be something else to learn, something new to learn when it comes to languages. Yeah, number one here, I like open to professional criticism. You have got to have thick skin. Other people will tell you, and not everybody does it the same way. Some people are better at making suggestions than others, but you got to know that you're not perfect. I remember I walked into a hearing in Jefferson County, and Joshua was interpreting. It was a psychologist. You probably don't even remember. You had just returned from Miami. And when it was my turn to interpret, I'm like, what in the world is this guy talking about? So if Joshua had been listening to me, he probably would have had a thing or two to correct, or suggestions. He had also been doing the hearing from before, so he may have had more background than I did. But you got to be open to that. Get yourself a good colleague, get yourself a good mentor that is willing to listen to your interpretations and to correct and help you. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. You got to love the justice system, and you got to respect it. It's imperfect. Not every time things work out the way we think it is, but at least from my experience, it's the best out there. Flexibility and adaptability, because the life and the work of a court interpreter is nothing if not fluid. Never a dull moment. Like Joshua says sometimes when something happens and he sends an email, never a dull moment. That's right. You could be in this courtroom here. You're waiting for your case. They're not ready. And one of us gives you an assignment. Go someplace else and do something. You may have to switch from a family law case into a criminal case, and your mind has to be on top of it. Creativity and mental agility, and comfortable working without a net. Yes, at the first few assignments, we will be with you. It's possible that when we start you, we will accompany you to a courtroom and get you going with a misdemeanor or a traffic case. But eventually, you will have to be on your own. Eventually, you will have to work without that safety blanket or safety net. And you will have to be able to find solutions, which is what we call, find a synonym. I can't get stuck on this word. What is the idea? So you got to have that creativity. You got to have the mental agility to come up with solutions right there, because interpreting is like that. It's live, it's right there. It's very fast paced. Okay, so this was relatively short, you can contact us with questions. Please do. The email addresses are there. We're going to give them to you every time at the end of each one of these. Send us any questions. I think something interpreters have in common is that, like I said before, we love to help. We love to help people, and we love to help people who want to be interpreters. So any questions you have, send them to us and one of us will answer. I suggest that you email both of us, because a lot of times Joshua and I may have different answers to the same question. Not that either one is right or wrong, is we may look at it differently, or we may come at it from different perspectives. So you may get two perspectives from on the same subject.
Very nice. Thank you so much, Armada. Guys, we will see you next time. One thing I want to mention before we finish up for the day, and I think it's important maybe to say this now and probably other times throughout, I don't want anyone to come away from any presentation of our orientation thinking that what is really required is perfection to be a court interpreter. That's true when we talk about bilingualism, and I know we went through that. Traits and skills. When we get to ethics, I think that sometimes people are hesitant to get into court interpreting because it does seem scary. It seems like you got to be perfect and there's no room for error and there's not even room to learn, and nothing could be farther from the truth. I've been doing this for about a decade and a half, and man, I'm still learning every day. Every day getting better. Just like Marta said, when you get to a point in which you feel like there's nothing else to learn, it's probably time to hang it up. You're probably ready for retirement. And fortunately, because we work in such a diverse, dynamic environment, you're constantly learning. So keep that in mind. If you can't do the things that we covered today, it's okay. You don't have to do them today. In fact, when you take the certification exam, to pass that exam, you also don't have to be perfect. We have to show that you have minimal competency to interpret, and we'll get there together. So don't feel discouraged if you're going through some of this stuff. You're thinking, "Wow, I'm not this," or "Wow, I'm not enough bilingual to do this." No, not at all. Maybe today that's true, but tomorrow's a different day, and we're going to keep working together. So come back to the next presentation. All right, watch again. We will be back in touch soon. Do contact us. As Marta said, we're glad to assist. That's all we got, guys. We'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
See you. Thank you.